in a sunburned country. Part 1. Into the Outback. Chapter 1. Flying into Australia, I realized with a sigh that I had forgotten again who their Prime Minister is. I am forever doing this with the Australian Prime Minister, committing the name to memory, forgetting it generally more or less instantly, then feeling terribly guilty. My thinking is that there ought to be one person outside Australia who knows. But then Australia is such a difficult country to keep track of. On my first visit, some years ago, I passed time on the long flight reading a history of Australian politics in the 20th century, wherein I encountered the startling fact that in 1967, the Prime Minister Harold Holt was strolling along a beach in Victoria when he plunged into the surf and vanished. No trace of the poor man was ever seen again. This seemed doubly astounding to me. First, that Australia could just lose a Prime Minister. I mean, come on. And second, that the news of this had never reached me. The fact is, of course, we pay shamefully scant attention to our dear cousins down under. Not entirely without reason, of course. Australia is, after all, mostly empty and a long way away. Its population, just over 18 million, is small by world standards. China grows by a larger amount each year, and its place in the world economy is consequently peripheral. As an economic entity, it ranks about level with Illinois. Its sports are of little interest to us, and the last television series it made that we watched with avidity was Skippy. From time to time it sends us useful things: opals, merino wool, Errol Flynn, the boomerang, but nothing we can't actually do without. Above all, Australia doesn't misbehave. It is stable and peaceful and good. It doesn't have coup, recklessly overfish, armed disagreeable despots, grow coca in provocative quantities, or throw its weight around in a brash and unseemly manner. But even allowing for all this, our neglect of Australian affairs is curious. Just before I set off on this trip, I went to my local library in New Hampshire and looked Australia up in the New York Times Index to see how much it had engaged our attention in recent years. I began with the 1997 volume for no other reason than that it was open on the table. In that year, across the full range of possible interests, politics, sports, travel, the coming Olympics in Sydney, food and wine, the arts, obituaries and so on, the Times ran 20 articles that were predominantly on or about Australian affairs. In the same period, for purposes of comparison, the Times ran 120 articles on Peru, 150 or so on Albania, and a similar number on Cambodia, more than 300 on each of the Koreas, and well over 500 on Israel. As a place that caught our interest, Australia ranked about level with Belarus and Burundi. Among the general subjects that outstripped it were balloons and balloonists, the Church of Scientology, dogs, though not dog sledding, Barney's Inc., and Pamela Harriman, the former ambassador and socialite who died in February 1997, a misfortune that evidently required recording 22 times in the Times. Put in the crudest terms, Australia was slightly more important to us in 1997 than bananas, but not nearly as important as ice cream. As it turns out, 1997 was actually quite a good year for Australian news. In 1996, the country was subject of just 9 news reports, and in 1998, a mere 6. Australians can't bear that we pay so little attention to them, and I don't blame them. This is a country where interesting things happen, and all the time. Consider just one of those stories that did make it into the Times in 1997, though buried away in the odd socks drawer of Section C. In January of that year, according to a report written in America by a Times reporter, scientists were seriously investigating the possibility that a mysterious seismic disturbance in the remote Australian outback almost 4 years earlier had been a nuclear explosion set off by members of the Japanese doomsday cult Aum Shinrikyo. It happens that at 11:03 p.m. local time on May 28, 1993, seismograph needles all over the Pacific region twitched and scribbled in response to a very large-scale disturbance near a place called Banjawan Station in the Great Victoria Desert of Western Australia. Some long-distance truckers and prospectors, virtually the only people out in that lonely expanse, reported seeing a sudden flash in the sky and hearing or feeling the boom of a mighty but far-off explosion. One reported that a can of beer had danced off the table in his tent. The problem was that there was no obvious explanation. The seismograph traces didn't fit the profile for an earthquake or mining explosion, and anyway, the blast was 170 times more powerful than the most powerful mining explosion ever recorded in Western Australia. The shock was consistent with a large meteorite strike, but the impact would have blown a crater hundreds of feet in circumference, and no such crater could be found. The upshot is that scientists puzzled over the incident for a day or two, then filed it away as an unexplained curiosity, the sort of thing that presumably happens from time to time. Then in 1995, Aum Shinrikyo gained sudden notoriety when it released extravagant quantities of the nerve gas sarin into the Tokyo subway system, killing 12 people. In the investigations that followed, it emerged that Aum's substantial holdings included a 500,000-acre desert property in Western Australia, very near the site of the mystery event. There, authorities found a laboratory of unusual sophistication and focus, and evidence that cult members had been mining uranium. It separately emerged that Aum had recruited into its ranks 2 nuclear engineers from the former Soviet Union. The group's avowed aim was the destruction of the world, and it appears that the event in the desert may have been a dry run for blowing up Tokyo. You take my point, of course. This is a country that loses a prime minister and that is so vast and empty that a band of amateur enthusiasts could conceivably set off the world's first non-governmental atomic bomb on its mainland, and almost 4 years would pass before anyone noticed. Clearly, this is a place worth getting to know. And so, because we know so little about it, perhaps a few facts would be in order. Australia is the world's sixth largest country and its largest island. It is the only island that is also a continent, and the only continent that is also a country. It was the first continent conquered from the sea and the last. It is the only nation that began as a prison. It is the home of the largest living thing on earth, the Great Barrier Reef, and of the largest monolith, Ayers Rock, or Uluru to use its non-official, more respectful Aboriginal name. It has more things that will kill you than anywhere else. Of the world's 10 most poisonous snakes, all are Australian. 5 of its creatures, the funnel web spider, box jellyfish, blue rings octopus, paralysis tick, and stonefish, are the most lethal of their type in the world. This is a country where even the fluffiest of caterpillars can lay you out with a toxic nip, where seashells will not just sting you but actually sometimes go for you. Pick up an innocuous cone shell from a Queensland beach, as innocent tourists are all too wont to do, and you will discover that the little fellow inside is not just astoundingly swift and testy, but exceedingly venomous. If you are not stung or pronged to death in some unexpected manner, you may be fatally chomped by sharks or crocodiles, or carried helplessly out to sea by irresistible currents, or left to stagger to an unhappy death in the baking outback. It's a tough place. And it is old. For 60 million years since the formation of the Great Diving Range, the low but deeply fetched mountains that run down its eastern flank, Australia has been all but silent geologically. In consequence, things once created have tended just to lie there. So many of the oldest objects ever found on Earth, the most ancient rocks and fossils, the earliest animal tracks and riverbeds, the first faint signs of life itself, have come from Australia. At some undetermined point in the great immensity of its past, perhaps 45,000 years ago, perhaps 60,000, but certainly before there were modern humans in the America or Europe, it was quietly invaded by a deeply inscrutable people, the Aborigines, who have no clearly evident racial or linguistic kinship to their neighbors in the region, and whose presence in Australia can only be explained by positing that they invented and mastered ocean-going craft at least 30,000 years in advance of anyone else, in order to undertake an exodus, then forget or abandon nearly all that they had learned, and scarcely ever bothered with the open sea again. It is an accomplishment so singular and extraordinary, so uncomfortable with scrutiny that most histories breeze over it in a paragraph or two, then move on to the second, more explicable invasion. The one that begins with the arrival of Captain James Cook and his doughty little ship HMS Endeavour in Botany Bay in 1770. Never mind that Captain Cook didn't discover Australia and that he wasn't even yet a captain at the time of his visit. For most people, including most Australians, this is where the story begins. The world those first Englishmen found was famously inverted, its seasons back to front, its constellations upside down, and unlike anything any of them had seen before, even in the near latitude of the Pacifics. Its creatures seemed to have evolved as if they had misread the manual. The most characteristic of them didn't run or lope or camp there, but bounced across the landscape like dropped balls. The continent teemed with unlikely life. It
Sure, yep.
contained a fish that could climb trees, a fox that flew. It is actually a very large bat.
These are your books, I think.
Thank you. Crustaceans so large that a grown man could climb inside their shells. In short, there was no place in the world like it. There still isn't. 80% of all that lives in Australia, plant and animal, exists nowhere else. More than this, it exists in an abundance that seems incompatible with the harshness of the environment. Australia is the driest, flattest, hottest, most desiccated, infertile, and climatically aggressive of all the inhabited countries. Only Antarctica is more hostile to life. This is a place so inert that even the soil is, technically speaking, a fossil, and yet it teems with life in numbers uncounted. Thank you. For insects alone, scientists haven't the faintest idea whether the total number of species is 100,000 or more than twice that. As many as a third of those species remain entirely unknown to science. For spiders, the proportion rises to 80%. I mention insects in particular because I have a story about a little bug called Nothomyremesia macrops that I think illustrates perfectly, if a bit obliquely, what an exceptional country this is. It's a slightly involved tale, but a good one, so bear with me, please. In 1931, on the Cape Arid Peninsula in Western Australia, some amateur naturalists were poking about in the scrubby waste when they found an insect none had seen before. It looked vaguely like an ant, but was an unusual pale yellow and had strange, staring, distinctly unsettling eyes. Some specimens were collected, and these found their way to the desk of an expert at the National Museum of Victoria in Melbourne, who identified the insect at once as Nothomyremesia. The discovery caused great excitement because, as far as anyone knew, nothing like it had existed on Earth for 100 million years. Nothomyremesia was a proto-ant, a living relic from a time when ants were evolving from wasps. In entomological terms, it was as extraordinary as if someone had found a herd of triceratops grazing on some distant grassy plain. An expedition was organized at once, but despite the most scrupulous searching, no one could find the Cape Arid colony. Subsequent searches came up equally empty-handed. Almost half a century later, when word got out that a team of American scientists was planning to search for the ant, almost certainly with the kind of high-tech gadgetry that would make the Australians look amateurish and under-organized. Government scientists in Canberra decided to make one final preemptive effort to find the ants alive, so a party of them set off in convoy across the country. On the second day out, while driving across the South Australia desert, one of their vehicles began to smoke and sputter, and they were forced to make an unscheduled overnight stop at a lonely pause in a highway called Poochera. During the event, one of the scientists, a man named Bob Taylor, stepped out for a breath of air and idly played his flashlight over the surrounding terrain. You may imagine his astonishment when he discovered, crawling over the trunk of a eucalyptus beside the campsite, a thriving colony of none other than Nothomymesia. Now consider the probabilities. Taylor and his colleagues were 800 miles from their intended search site. In the almost 3 million square miles of emptiness that is Australia, one of the handful of people able to identify it had just found one of the rarest, most sought-after insects on Earth. An insect seen alive just once, almost half a century earlier, and all because the van had broken down where it did. Nothomymesia, incidentally, has still never been found at its original site. You take my point again, I'm sure. This is a country that is at once staggeringly empty and yet packed with stuff, interesting stuff, and ancient stuff not readily explained, stuff yet to be found. Trust me, this is an interesting place.